Good afternoon. Thank you to the Animal Welfare Foundation for giving me this opportunity to hopefully update and enlighten the audience on current DEFRA proposals on the new animal licensing regime. DEFRA obviously carried out a consultation in December 2015 and in February of this year announced their proposals of how they wanted to change the animal licensing legislation to tackle some of the obvious problems that exist. Really what I want to do today in sort of literally 15 minutes, which is going to be fairly swift, is look at some of the problems that exist with the current regime, look at some of the proposals that have been put on the table and how the expert panel that DEFRA have created are trying to look at how they may be implemented. But more importantly, take this opportunity with the veterinary professionals in the audience to look at some of those proposals and seek some debate, discussion around what you feel would also benefit from the change to the existing regime. So, just to put it into context, local authorities' responsibilities in terms of companion animal welfare. Currently, local authorities really only have two statutory duties for companion animals. Those being stray dogs, which from 2008, local authorities had a 24/7 responsibility put upon them. And obviously animal licensing establishments with legislation that, as I say, dates back over sort of 60 odd years. As you can see on there as well, there are a lot of non-statutory functions that local authorities do try or varies up and down the country dependent on the interest or desire that those local authorities have. And as I say, certainly my local authority has been very supportive of us carrying out those tasks in the last 10, 15 years. Unfortunately, with the austerity measures that are now very much entrenched within the local authorities, some of those non-statutory functions, which ultimately directly affect the statutory functions, are having to be seriously considered. I mean, to put that into some kind of context, in Stockton, we've had to cut £52 million in the last 6 years from Stockton's overall budget, and in the next 3 years, we've got to save another £21 million. So in 10 years, that's a 61% cut in our overall budget. So that's the sort of pressure we're under to sort of maintain non-statutory duties. So, very quickly, problems with the existing regime. As I touched on earlier, we've got legislation that is over 60 years old and quite frankly is unfit for purpose. It wasn't written or designed for the current business models that exist out there. It certainly wasn't written with the thought of the internet. And it certainly doesn't cover sort of modern day practices, standards as part of its ethos. The other issue that exists in terms of the licensing function that local authorities carry out is licensing, depending where it sits within the local authority, can be, or the licensing of animal establishments more specifically, can be quite low down in the priority list. I mean, in most local authorities, animal licensing probably falls about fourth in terms of importance or the volume of work that licensing's done. Usually coming before that is things like taxis, alcohol and gambling. So it's constantly striving for that level of recognition. I think probably one of the biggest issues with the current regime is the lack of clear, concise guidance. So that local authorities actually know what is expected of them. And I think to some extent that is very much, again, echoed probably, and again, some of the discussion will touch on that within the veterinary profession as well. And hopefully some of the proposals that we're looking at will address that. Definitely one of the criticisms of local authorities, and as I say, as a local authority person, I can't really defend it, is there is definitely a lack of suitably competent and experienced officers. And again, that has been made worse in recent years with a loss of good staff from local authorities that have either retired or moved on. And again, it's also brought about through the lack of training that is currently available for local authority staff. And lastly, really, the other issue I just want to touch on is the current legislation really doesn't have great powers for local authorities to intervene with premises when they are failing. Ultimately, in a lot of the legislation, you literally have to wait till the wheels fall off and take a prosecution case, which at that point, and given the framework of our court system, can take an awful long time to deal with a non-compliant premise. So that, in a nutshell, is some of the issues, which ultimately a lot of that creates the main issue of inconsistency. Inconsistency of how the legislation is applied, implemented and ultimately enforced. So, the proposals. These are some of the proposals that have come from, as I say, DEFRA, based on a lot of the feedback that they got from various stakeholders. The National Companion Animal Focus Group, which our chair was one of those. And one of the things that we very much wanted DEFRA to take on board, which thankfully they have, is a risk-based approach. A risk-based approach is how local authorities, environmental health, which is my background, tackle and regulate most legislation. We inspect on risk, and based on risk, we judge how we then deal with that premise. So if a premise is managing their risks, dealing with them well trained, good standards, that business gets a light touch approach. If we've got a non-compliant business or a business that's failing, then the local authority or the inspector will have much more input into that business. So the risk-based approach is about creating a system that rewards good premises. And what we want to see as part of the proposals is a risk-based approach that is public-facing. So it will actually reward and encourage businesses to reach high welfare standards. And as part of that public-facing system, what we're hoping is that that will ultimately get buy-in from the consumer. So if we get buy-in from the consumer, that will drive standards up, and for the first time, the consumer will be able to make an informed choice about what animal establishment they choose to use, whether that's a boarding establishment, whether that's a dog breeder, whether that's a riding school. So we see that as an integral part of this, and ultimately it needs to be simple but clear and transparent so that the public can understand that. And ultimately what this will allow, given that, as I say, resource issues is a problem within local authorities, it will allow local authorities to divert what little resource they possibly may have to those businesses that are non-compliant or struggling to comply. So that's what we'd like to see as a fundamental part, and as I say, thankfully that is something that we are now seriously discussing with DEFRA. One of the other things, obviously, that is going to come out of this is brand new regulations that hopefully will be fit for purpose and suit the modern day landscape. So those regulations, first and foremost, are going to take some of the core elements out of the current model licence conditions and put them within schedules in the regulations. So that will actually, for the first time, mean that those are a legal minimum requirement. So that will quite clearly set out to business and to local authorities exactly what the premise needs to meet. And how we're hoping that will sort of sit for those of you that are aware or use the farmed animal welfare regs, it will look similar, hopefully, to that. So there will be a schedule for dog boarding, a schedule for what I would class as true commercial dog boarding, dog home boarding, dog day creche, cat boarding, riding schools, etc. And then those schedules, the real meat and the detail that will be needed for those schedules will be backed up in statutory guidance. And that statutory guidance is going to have to be very clear, because ultimately within that guidance is going to hopefully be the tool that both the inspector and the industry look at to so that they are completely clear as to the standards that they need to meet. And if they do want to choose potentially the higher standards, which they will then obviously reap the benefits of getting a higher score, it'll allow them to see what they need to do going forward, whether that's, as I say, some of it could be things that they can put into place fairly quickly, but it could also be things that they need to build into a 2, 3, 4, 5-year plan to improve their business. And that guidance document for me is ultimately what is going to be critical, and it's going to be critical to the veterinary profession, because I think for the first time it will really help them, those vets that get involved in an inspection. It will help them understand the whole process, but it will hopefully promote consistency of the standards that are being asked and audited for. So, as I say, all those issues, really, the main thing that the guidance will also cover as well will be sort of standard application forms and also a framework about fees. Because again, one of the biggest criticisms for local authorities is that, you know, one local authority might charge £45 for a boarding establishment licence and another local authority charges £650. The new system, the whole ethos of it, it will be full cost recovery, and it has to be for the local authority. But that fee framework will hopefully, as I say, mitigate those extremes of charging. So as I say, the overall aim of the new system is definitely to promote consistent application of standards and consistent enforcement, and hopefully buy-in from the industry and the consumer. As part of the, this is just, don't take this on face value that this is exactly what it's going to be, because it's not. This is the example of a risk framework that we, the National Companion Animal Focus Group, put together to help sell the idea to DEFRA, so that they could actually understand what we were looking at. I don't know whether you can read it actually, but ultimately what we're looking at is a simple, fairly clear system. There may be three standards, there may be 4 standards, again, that hasn't been finalised yet. But the concept of it is that it's going to allow flexibility over the licence of a premise. So a premise that has good standards, good compliance history, well managed, you know, staff have got good qualifications, and through a proper audited inspection, the local authority are happy with the way that business is run, then that business may potentially get a licence that lasts 2 or 3 years. And in between that period, there will be built into that the odd unannounced visit. For those businesses that are only meeting the minimum standards, they may then get like a 1-year or 2-year inspection. And for businesses that are slightly failing, they will potentially be dealt with some new powers in the regulations, similar to the powers that we have under the Animal Welfare Act of improvement notices that set out quite stringent timeframes that business is expected to be brought back into compliance. So that's the sort of framework that we're looking at. As I say, it's very early days. We've been hot in discussions for about 4 months now, but we are, I think, starting to get down to something that is potentially going to be a workable model. And as part of that, which will be within the guidance, there will need to be a scoring matrix. And that scoring matrix will potentially pick out those elements of the model licence conditions that standards can be improved beyond the minimum standards that will be contained within the schedules. And this sort of matrix will again be a very extremely important document for the local authority inspector, the business, and also the veterinary officer, so that they can quite clearly see where that business lies and ultimately score that business consistently. And again, that was just an example that we put together to ultimately try and sow, or in effect sell that model to DEFRA as a way forward. So, moving forward, hopefully with the new regime, which optimistically DEFRA would like to have in place by autumn next year, what would we like to see going forward to sort of complement that and ultimately make that system work? Certainly, I'm from a unitary authority, so one of the functions that I also look after is animal health, so we do the farm livestock inspections. One of the things that we would like to see nationally for companion is a framework similar to that we have in place between the local authorities and the APHA that we sign up to. And again, I think for this new companion animal licence and establishment framework to work, we need a similar sort of thing. We certainly need data collection and trend identification, which for me, given that if we're going to get some consistency, that will be fairly simple to do. Again, the EFRA committee really had a bit of a question as to the lack of information that's available nationally. And again, without the FOIs that local authorities constantly get, which can be a problem, you know, there's no reason why local authorities can't return annual returns on a lot of the animal establishment licences that they're dealing with. And again, that will pick up trends, it will pick up issues where the new system is working well or issues where it isn't working well. Extending the licensing regime further, again, hopefully if the initial stage works well and it's proven to work well, then there are certainly calls for other elements of unregulated animal licensing work to be considered to fit within the regime. So there we're looking at, you know, things like livery yards, we're looking at dog groomers, we're looking potentially at dog walkers, you name it. There are certain areas that definitely could do with coming under some kind of licensing regime. National database. I mean, currently one of the biggest issues with a lot of the dog breeding issues is that unfortunately dog dealers, dog traders, rogue dealers don't operate within the remit and boundaries of one local authority. So the lack of joined up working between local authorities, other agencies, is quite frightening, quite scary, and that's certainly something that needs tackling because unfortunately villains don't work within small areas. And as I say, realistically, local authorities can't really be expected, or every local authority can't be expected to have an expert within their own organisation. It's just not practical with the current austerity measures that exist. So there needs to be better regional forums, regional approaches, where local authorities can tap into both veterinary experts, but also experts within local authorities that can help that local authority deal with an existing problem. And I suppose long-term going forward, as I touched on, the licensing regime is ultimately supposed to be cost-neutral to the local authority, but there does need to be a more detailed look at the overall role of local authorities in companion animal welfare and how that potentially is going to be resourced going forward. And that is the whirlwind tour. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. So you've provoked a large number of questions, as you might expect. Mark and Gudrun are going to field these, so that's fine. Yeah. You can come and join us here, Mark, if you would like to. Okay. So I think quite a few of the questions perhaps relate to frustration in the current situation and opportunities for going forward. So that's a positive thing. So a question that's been asked by quite a few people is, should the responsibility for licensing be moved to APHA for more consistency and efficiency rather than local authorities, and should there be, if you like, local veterinary inspectors approved for this particular purpose? So,
well, I can do the second part of the question, potentially. I can't do the first part, so I'll let you do the first part.
Obviously, being from a local authority background, I mean, again, it's certainly, I think I touched on that at the end, it's ultimately what government wants from local authorities in terms of the resource that's there. I know it was something that potentially came up in terms of some kind of national inspectorate as part of the consultation. But whether or not APHA, with the relationship that we have with them doing farmed animal health, have got the capacity either to do animal licensing establishments, I don't know. It's certainly been raised, but whether or not it's actually going to ever develop, I don't really know, to be honest.
Gudrun, what's your take on that?
I think I don't think I could answer on the APHA local authority side, but certainly in terms of the veterinary profession, we're absolutely well placed to be the experts in this area, and vets are working with local authorities currently around licensing. Now, we're talking more about the sort of companion animal small side, not the riding establishments, and the Equine Sector Council are dealing with that at the moment, and it's a different remit there at the moment. But when we look at the smaller side of things, we don't have a sort of registration there. And I think, as Mark has highlighted, there needs to be consistency and confidence in what the vets are doing within that as well. And talking to vets that are doing licensing, just out of interest, could people put their hand up if they do any licensing for local authorities in here? So there's probably like small animals, sorry, for pet shops basically. So there's probably 2 or 3, and I don't know if your experience is the same, but talking to people who've done this quite a lot, they say that there is quite a disparity in consistency of knowledge because a pet shop can have a wide range of species in there. And talking with Mark, that actually they need consistency and confidence across the board. So we would probably recommend that we could hold a register that was then people who were competent in this area, that had the necessary training to do that. And BVZS have probably taken a step forward with this in that they have a list for zoo inspections. The difficulty would be if you had a statutory list of that, enforcing that, manning that, etc., and is that what we want? But I suppose the challenge and what Mark and I are interested in from the audience is, could we do that internally as a profession, have an established list that we can share with local authorities so they have the consistency they need to call on for the people with the expertise in that species when they need it?
Okay, thank you.
Any response from anyone who does that they think that could be?
Yes, a comment
John
from the back.
It's John. Okay, no, that's fine. I thought BVZS, it was from our submission. They've got a form for... Yeah.
The form again is APHA for zoos. BVZS have it for pet shops.
Yep.
But the inspector...
Yeah, for pet shops. Yeah.
Trained, and then local authorities apply for an inspector for a certain zoo or 2 for certain other types, and then APHA put recommendations for us we should do it.
Yeah, it's for pet shops, I should have been clearer. So the zoo inspections is a separate one. But for pet shop licences, it's having that list there, and whether we think that as a profession we should have that list. I suppose it comes back a little bit to what we were talking about on pressure of doing things for vets. If vets are being asked, in a general practice, being asked to go and do a pet shop licence, the junior member, but they haven't had the training, etc., or the knowledge to do that. If we collectively, as a profession, thought actually it should be with a list and have some competencies and consistencies around that, that is a good idea.
Okay, so we've got quite a few hands up. Is this a point about this issue, please?
It is.
Yeah, fire away then, please.
Jackie Patterson, I'm a veterinary surgeon in Stockton-on-Tees, and I do animal pet shop licensing, boarding establishment licensing, not within Stockton-on-Borough, as Stockton-on-Tees, I hasten to add, as there might be a bit of a conflict of interest there. I'd just like to point out, from doing local authority inspections, 2 points. One is there's huge disparity. I'd like to compliment Stockton-on-Tees Borough Council for their enforcement of animal welfare legislation. They do a very, very good job, as do the authority I do inspections for. But around us, there are authorities that do not use vets and have very poor enforcement. But on the usage of vets, my comment would be, having spoken to many vets and to legislators, I think the veterinary profession does not understand how the legislation needs to be used, and their opinion of trying to enforce welfare whilst using that legislation does not match. So even with the Animal Welfare Act, we come at it from a very welfare-based orientation, but we have no understanding of how the legislation works. And I think that's an important a deficit in veterinary education that ought to be addressed, in that we ought to be made more aware of how legislation is actually enforced. It's not good enough just to say, oh, that's awful. we should do something about it, we need to understand how the legislation works. And I think the veterinary profession are lacking with that on quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a comment on this from the other side of the aisle, please, gentleman there, and then we'll move on to the next. Wave your hand. Thank you. And then we'll move on to the next topic. Thank you.
Hello, Mike Seaton. Talking about this list idea, I think the RCVS and the BVA have the riding inspectors establishment list, and that's worked very well for a number of years. And I can't fundamentally see any reason why that wouldn't work for other establishments. It provides consistency. There is a sort of training program, which is the consistency people would require. And I think that's quite a good model.
Yeah, thank you very much. So picking up also, quite a few people have mentioned this issue and the list of licensed or approved veterinarians doing this. So that, it sort of touches on an earlier comment, I think. So a slightly different issue, and it's a bit about the scope of the new Act, really. So quite a few, we've rolled a few questions in together here, and it's basically a lot of pet businesses sell unsuitable, welfare-compromising products, small hutches, muesli mixes for rabbits and so forth. Are those sort of things going to come under the scope, as you see them, Mark?
I mean, certainly the scope ultimately is primarily aimed at the welfare of the animals within the premises that are being sold. And bear in mind, this isn't just your traditional high street pet shop. This is potentially an online seller that is operating from a domestic premise. So that there is quite a plethora of business types that this will need to apply to. I think what's critical is ultimately going to be DEFRA's decision on what is commercial selling. You know, there are so many loopholes in the current regimes around that whole issue. So that's going to have to be clearly defined, and it's ultimately about how far the net wants to fall. Some would argue, obviously, for someone selling some unwanted guinea pigs that their guinea pig has had isn't going to be within that remit, but there's going to have to be some fairly clear guidelines as to what is encompassed within the new selling licence, as it's being called. And as I say, as part of that definitions, what also is going to be classed as a pet animal. I mean, currently the classic one is horse dealers. Horse dealers sell horses that are predominantly sold as pets, but they don't fall currently within the Pet Animals Act. So, you know, is the new regime going to catch horse dealers? Are they going to be required to have a selling licence? So there's a lot of fundamentals still to be resolved around that.
I mean, just picking up on that, there are a few comments about the popularity of and the growth in dog daycare businesses. Should the proprietors of those businesses have a minimal level of qualification or some credential to show?
Yeah. Again, that's why we want to, again, we've touched on the whole thing of people fitting their pets in around their lifestyles, and as a consequence of that, day boarding, whether it's in a traditional commercial kennel. I mean, a lot of our traditional commercial boarding establishments now, the majority of their business is dog daycare. 30, 40 people go drop the dog off at 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning and go and collect it at 6 o'clock at night. And that's a complete swing from the sort of traditional 2-week holiday period. So whether it's in that type of environment, or unfortunately we see, industrial units that get converted for dog day creche or home boarding, the type of obviously there are going to be different standards in those different businesses in terms of how they operate, but ultimately the competency of the people that are running those businesses needs to be taken account in terms of the schedules and the guidance that's out there.
Well, I know that we're not just talking about dogs, of course, but a question that came in early on was, would it be helpful to consolidate all of the dog legislation into one act or into one packet somehow? What do you think?
In an ideal world, probably yes, but when you then start to touch on dangerous dog issues and other things, I think it's ultimately how far you want the scope to go. I mean, certainly in terms of the animal establishment, we need to tackle dog breeding, dog boarding, which, as I say, a lot of that stuff does interrelate with each other. And it's really just trying to make that legislation and guidance reflect the current business models that exist out there.
And I think quite a few of the comments have related to, have sort of picked up on this risk-based frequency of inspection, which it could apply to riding establishments, dealers, sanctuaries, quite a wide range of new applications of that, which I think is finding some positive vibes there. So we're going to have to draw this to an end in a moment, I'm afraid, and unfortunately I'm not going to get to most of the questions we've got. But just we'll pick up on this. There may be one or two comments from the audience, but bearing in mind the difficulties in policing the current requirements, how do you feel that any further or future regulations could be more easily monitored? It's a sort of resourcing issue, I guess, that you mentioned in your presentation.
Yeah, it ultimately is a resource issue. I mean, again, if the new regime allows it to be full cost recovery, then the local authority, in theory, they can build in an element of enforcement within that licensing regime. As I say, those businesses that are good and that the local authority can give a light touch approach to, it may be that they do give a 3-year licence and maybe you've got one unannounced visit in that period. And again, that's about good inspection. It's about a fully audited inspection that is done by staff that are competent and understand the risks appropriate to that business. If the net goes a bit further in terms of, potentially livery yards, which it would be a huge undertaking, it inevitably will need a resource issue for local authorities to recruit potentially extra staff based on that full cost recovery.
But I think it's important as well that some of this can be used as an education tool. And we've always said that there's no point in having massive change of legislation if we can't enforce it. But some of what Mark's team can do is help us to inform our clients about risk and about what is good and what they should be looking for. And a lot of what we've talked about today is around educating the public, which is where we play a picture. We play a picture within the regulation when we work with the local authorities. But if we can come up with a framework that is easy for potential owners and others to understand, we can start doing some of that change management without having to rely all the time on the enforcement side of things.
Again, I think one of the biggest fundamental, if we can for the first time get the consumer to be able to make an informed choice, that is ultimately going to drive standards up. And just through market pressure it'll make businesses decide, I need to keep ahead of the game here, otherwise my business isn't going to exist, and that is critical, I think, to moving it forward. Similar to you've got for scores on the doors for food businesses.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have to call a halt to the question and answer session here. So thank you, Gudrun and Mark, very much for that.